Before we get into today's video, we want to bring you a word from our sponsor, Bright Cellars. After a long day of researching, writing, and talking about horrifying things that people do to each other, I love a nice glass of wine. This is exactly why I love Bright Cellars, which is a monthly wine subscription service. One big problem I have when it comes to wine is I want to try different kinds, but there are so many different varieties at the wine store that I never know what to pick. When you sign up for Bright Cellars, you fill out a simple quiz of 7 questions and they find wine that will suit your tastes. I no longer have to stand around in the store reading labels and trying to imagine what a wine tastes like. Then each month they deliver wine directly to my house. So not only do I get great tasting wine, but I don't even have to leave my house to get it. Also, each box comes with wine education cards that outline tasting notes, suggested pairings, best serving temperature, and origin. It's a good way to look classy and sophisticated in front of your friends and family. One thing you may be wondering, what if I happen to get a wine that I don't like? Well, Bright Cellars has an amazing concierge team. So if you received a bottle that you didn't love, they'll send you a replacement in the next box. Bright Cellars is giving my followers 60% off their first 4-bottle box. Please support my channel by following the link to take the quiz and get started today. Number 3. Dorothy Stratten. Dorothy Ruth Hogg Stratten was born in February 1960 in Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada. She grew up in Coquitlam, which is a city about 18 miles from downtown Vancouver. In early 1978, Dorothy was working at a Dairy Queen in Coquitlam. One day, a 26-year-old man named Paul Snyder came into the Dairy Queen. He worked as a promoter for car and cycling shows. But Snyder liked the finer things in life. He drove a black Corvette and he wore tailored suits and expensive jewelry. To supplement his income, Snyder worked as a pimp. When Snyder saw Dorothy, he saw something special. He got her phone number and they started dating. Dorothy liked Snyder because he was an older man who showered her with gifts. Dorothy's father had left her family when she was young and they never had much money. Snyder convinced Dorothy to let him take some nude photos of her and send them to Playboy. She agreed, and in the summer of 1980, he sent the photos of 18-year-old Dorothy to Playboy. The editor of Playboy who got the photos was immediately impressed and asked Dorothy to fly out to Los Angeles, California for a test shoot. Dorothy ended up moving to Los Angeles in August 1978. She participated in the 25th anniversary Great Playmate Hunt and she was named a finalist. In October 1978, Paul Snyder moved to Los Angeles to be with Dorothy. They got married in June 1979 in Las Vegas, Nevada. The problem was that neither Dorothy nor Snyder had a green card, so neither of them could work legally in the United States. Hugh Hefner, the founder of Playboy, pulled some strings and got Dorothy a temporary work visa. In August 1979, Dorothy, who was now using the last name Stratten, was named Playmate of the Month. She also started working as a bunny at the Playboy Club in Century City. While working at the club, she became part of a different social circle and she met several influential people. It led to her being cast in several movies and TV shows. Her first role was an uncredited role in the comedy Americathon, which starred John Ritter and Fred Willard. This was followed by a small role in the roller disco comedy Skate Town, USA. She had guest roles on 2 popular television shows, Fantasy Island and Buck Rogers in the 25th Century. She finished out 1979 by starring in a movie. It was an exploitation movie called Autumn Born. In 1980, Dorothy was chosen to be Playmate of the Year. She was the first Canadian to receive the title. For the first 2 months of 1980, she did photo shoots for the spread for Playmate of the Year. Also during that time, she made a low-budget sci-fi comedy, Galaxina. Dorothy starred in the film as the titular character. Since Paul Snider still didn't have a green card or work permit, Dorothy supported them both financially. Even though they relied entirely on Dorothy's income, Snider tried to control everything. He was in charge of the money, he chose where they lived, and he drove her around. He even told her who she should sleep with to advance her career. None of Dorothy's friends liked Snider, and they encouraged her to leave him. Hugh Hefner told her that he had a pimp quality about him. In March 1980, Dorothy traveled to New York City because she had been cast in the movie They All Laughed, which was starring John Ritter and Audrey Hepburn. The film was being directed by Peter Bogdanovich from his own script. It was Dorothy's first credited role in a big-budget movie. During the production of the film, Dorothy and Bogdanovich started having an affair. In April 1980, it was officially announced that Dorothy was Playmate of the Year. After the announcement was made, she appeared on The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson. In June 1980, Dorothy broke off her relationship with Snider. Snider was furious. Without her, he did not have an income. He drained their joint bank account and sold anything he could get his hands on. This included a 1980 Jaguar XJS that Dorothy was given when she was named Playmate of the Year. Snider used some of the money to pay a private detective to follow Dorothy. Snider thought she might be having an affair, so he asked the private detective to investigate this. After the movie was finished shooting in New York, Dorothy traveled back to Los Angeles with Bogdanovich, and she moved into his mansion. By early August 1980, Paul Snider knew that Dorothy was involved in a romantic relationship with Bogdanovich. On August 14, 1980, Dorothy went over to the home she formerly shared with Snider and two roommates. It's believed she went there to discuss a monetary settlement for ending their marriage. When she got to the home, the roommates were away. The roommates returned home that evening and saw both Snider and Dorothy's cars in the driveway. The roommates watched TV for several hours, and they noticed it was awfully quiet in the couple's former bedroom. So one of them went to check on them, and they made a horrifying discovery. They said that the bedroom was something straight out of a horror movie. They called the police immediately. The police were later able to piece together what happened. The night before, Paul Snider had purchased a 12-gauge shotgun from a private seller he found in the classified ads. When Dorothy came over, he raped her and then shot her in the face with a shotgun. After she was dead, he sexually abused her body. About an hour after he killed her, he shot himself in the head with the same shotgun. Dorothy Stratten was 20 years old, and Paul Snider was 29 years old. The murder-suicide was big news in North America. Many people considered it to be a tragic loss because they thought that Dorothy's star was rising. Several critics said she had great natural comedic timing and she could have been a great comedic actor. After the murder, the last film that Dorothy starred in, They All Laughed, was released in several test markets. But the film performed poorly, so the studio decided not to do a wide release. Writer and director Peter Bogdanovich was disappointed that the movie wouldn't reach a national audience, and he wanted to preserve the memory of his former lover. So he purchased the film rights for North America for $5 million and then paid for its distribution. Unfortunately, he only saw a return of about $1 million. He ended up filing for bankruptcy in 1985 and he lost the mansion where he had briefly lived with Dorothy. Dorothy's short career as a model and an actress and her murder were the basis for two movies. One was the 1981 NBC made-for-TV movie Death of a Centerfold. Jamie Lee Curtis played Dorothy and Bruce Weitz played Snyder. In 1983, the story was again made into a movie. The film, Star 80, was directed by acclaimed director Bob Fosse and it starred Mariel Hemingway as Dorothy, and Snyder was played by Eric Roberts. Several songs have also been written about Dorothy. This includes The Best Was Yet to Come by Canadian rocker Bryan Adams. Adams also co-wrote the song Cover Girl, which was performed by the Canadian rock band Prism. British alternative rock band Bush has a song about Dorothy called Dead Meat, which is on their 1999 album, The Science of Things. In 1984, Peter Bogdanovich published a book entitled The Killing of the Unicorn. It was a biography of Dorothy and a memoir of his time with her. In the book, Bogdanovich blames Dorothy's murder on Hugh Hefner and the Playboy culture. He also claims that Hefner made sexual advances on Dorothy. In 1985, Hugh Hefner was interviewed by Geraldo Rivera. He denied making advances on Dorothy. He said that the blame for her murder lies at the feet of Bogdanovich. He said that their affair led to the downfall of Dorothy and Snyder's marriage. In December 1988, 49-year-old Peter Bogdanovich married Dorothy's 20-year-old sister, Louise. They were married for 13 years and divorced in 2001. Number 2. Ramon Novarro. Jose Ramon Gil Samaniego was born in February 1899 in Durango, Mexico. His father was a wealthy dentist. As a child, Jose learned to play the piano and he was a naturally good singer. He was also a skilled actor. As he grew into his teens, people noticed his striking good looks. In November 1910, the Mexican Revolution broke out, throwing the country into turmoil. In November 1915, 16-year-old Jose and his brother set out for Los Angeles, California. They arrived there on Thanksgiving 1915. When they arrived there, they found work being ushers at a theater and being busboys at restaurants. Not long after arriving in Los Angeles, Jose began looking for work as extras in films. His first role was in 1916's Joan the Woman, directed by the legendary Cecil B. DeMille. He had a small role as a starving peasant. In 1917 and 1918, he had minor, uncredited roles in 5 movies. In 1919, Jose moved to New York City, New York, to perform in stage plays. One play was successful, and it toured around the country. Jose returned to Los Angeles and the world of film in 1921. That year, he had 4 uncredited roles. In 1922, he got his first screen credit with a small role in the film Mr. Barnes of New York. His character dies in a duel early in the film. Next, he appeared in the 1922 film The Prisoner of Zenda. The movie was a success and it proved to be Jose's launchpad to stardom. For his next film, where he was one of the leads, Jose used a new stage name that was given to him by the studio, Ramon Novarro. In 1923, Ramon was cast in the lead role of Ben-Hur, A Tale of the Christ. The film was a massive production, and it went on to become the most expensive movie produced in the silent era. The film's final cost was $3.9 million, which is about $61 million in 2021. The film was a massive success, and it was MGM's highest-grossing movie. It would hold that record for 25 years. The film made Ramon Novarro one of the biggest movie stars in the world. In August 1926, movie star Rudolph Valentino died at the age of 31. Valentino had been billed as the Latin Lover. After Valentino's death, Ramon's movie studio started billing him as the Latin Lover. Ramon was considered a heartthrob, and he received fan mail from thousands of women. However, Ramon was gay, and he secretly dated several men. After Ben-Hur, Ramon became one of the highest paid actors in the world, making over $100,000 per film. In 1929, Ramon starred in his first talking film, Devil May Care. Ramon continued to make films with MGM, but none of them were as successful as Ben-Hur. In 1935, MGM chose not to renew his contract. Over the next 30 years, Ramon Novarro sporadically acted in films, and he had minor television roles. Sometime in the late 1960s, Ramon started using an escort service which provided him with male sex workers. On October 30th, 1968, Ramon got a call from a young man who said his name was Paul, and he offered him a sexual encounter. Paul said his 17-year-old brother would be coming with him. Paul said that he got Ramon's phone number from another sex worker named Larry Ortega. Ramon accepted the offer and told Paul to come over that evening. The next morning, Ramon's personal secretary arrived at Ramon's home in Laurel Canyon. He immediately noticed that the house had been ransacked. His secretary searched the house. In the bed in the master bedroom, he found the dead body of 69-year-old Ramon Novarro. His wrists were bound behind his back. Under his body, written on the bedsheet in ballpoint pen, was the name Larry. Ramon had a ballpoint pen in his hand. The medical examiner determined that Ramon had been tied up and beaten with a walking cane. He had also been punched and kicked several times. None of the blows were fatal, but when Ramon was left bound and unconscious, he drowned on his own blood. The police learned that Ramon had used the services of sex worker Larry Ortega. The police talked to Ortega, and he said that Ramon had called him to see if he gave his number to a guy named Paul who had a brother named Tom. Ortega then told the police he had a 22-year-old brother-in-law named Paul Ferguson. Paul had a 17-year-old brother named Tom. The police also looked at Ramon's phone records. On the night of Ramon's murder, someone had made a 40-minute phone call to Chicago, Illinois. They called the number and it belonged to a young woman. She said that her boyfriend, Tom Ferguson, had called her that night. She said that while they talked, she heard Ramon yelling for help in the background. It turned out that the brothers both had criminal records, and the police had their fingerprints on file. Their fingerprints were compared to fingerprints found at the crime scene. They were a match. The police tracked the brothers down, and they were arrested on November 6, 1968, about a week after the murder. Paul and Tom Ferguson's trial started on July 28, 1969. The district attorney said that the brothers went to the house because they heard Ramon kept a large sum of cash in the house. They tied him up and tortured him, demanding to know where the money was hidden. They also ransacked the house looking for the money. But Ramon didn't keep much money in his house. The lawyer for the brothers argued that they should be found guilty of manslaughter and not first-degree murder. For most of the trial, the brothers blamed each other for the murder. Then, late in the trial, Tom confessed to killing Ramon. He said that he beat up Ramon after Ramon came on to him sexually. He had never meant to kill him. He just hit him several times, breaking his nose, and then he accidentally suffocated. He wrote Larry on the bedsheet to cast suspicion away from them and onto Larry Ortega. The district attorney said that Tom confessed just to try to muddy the waters. They said that Tom was only taking the blame because he was 17 at the time of the murder, and he wouldn't be sentenced to death like his brother would be. The trial lasted for 2 months, and then the jury deliberated for 2.5 hours. Paul and Tom Ferguson were both found guilty of first-degree murder. In October 1969, they were sentenced to life in prison, and the judge recommended that they never be paroled. But they were both paroled less than a decade into their life sentences. In 1975, while in prison, Paul confessed that he worked alone when he murdered Ramon Novarro. He said that his brother was just inside the house and he didn't join in on the beating. So in 1976, Tom was paroled on a work furlough. He had served less than 8 years in prison. After Tom was paroled, he continued to get into trouble. In 1977, he was arrested for sexual assault and he was sent back to prison. In 1987, he was arrested for raping a 54-year-old woman. For that conviction, he served less than 3 years in prison. In March 2006, when Tom was in his mid-50s, he died by suicide by slitting his throat in a motel room. As for Paul, in 1975, he won a prestigious writing award from PEN America for a short story he wrote. He was the first prisoner ever to win the award. Paul was paroled in 1978 after serving less than 10 years for the murder of Ramon Novarro. In 1989, Paul was convicted of rape and sodomy in Missouri. He was sentenced to 60 years in prison. Paul Ferguson died in September 2018 while in prison. He was 72 years old. Number 1. Adrienne Shelly. Adrienne Levine was born in Queens, New York in June 1966. She had 2 brothers, and they grew up on Long Island. Adrienne had a strong interest in acting at a young age, and she performed in several regional stage plays. After graduating high school, Adrienne went to Boston University to study film production. She ended up dropping out in her 3rd year. She then moved to Manhattan and looked for acting work. She took on the stage surname Shelley in honor of her father, Sheldon. In 1989, Adrienne Shelly was cast as one of the lead roles in the indie dramedy The Unbelievable Truth. It played at the Sundance Film Festival and it was nominated for the Grand Jury Prize. Hal Hartley, the writer and the director of the film, liked working with Adrienne. So he rewrote an old script he had to suit her. The film, entitled Trust, was released in 1990. Throughout the early 1990s, Adrienne continued to get lead or supporting roles, mostly in indie comedies. Often, critics described her characters as quirky. In 1996, Adrienne made the jump into writing and directing with her film Sun Manhattan, which she also starred in. In 1999, she wrote, directed, and starred in another movie, I'll Take You There. Both movies that Adrienne wrote, directed, and starred in received mixed reviews and made very little money. In addition to being in over a dozen movies in the 1990s, Adrienne also starred in several off-Broadway plays. In 2000, Adrienne had a guest spot on an episode of Law & Order where she played a former porn star. In December 2002, Adrienne married Andy Ostroy, who was the CEO of a marketing firm. Adrienne became pregnant, and while she was pregnant, she wrote a script for a movie called Waitress. Waitress is about a pregnant woman named Jenna who works as a waitress in a diner in a small town in the Deep South. She is married to an abusive man but finds a new love interest when a handsome doctor moves to town. In 2006, Waitress went into production with Adrienne as its director. The movie's budget was $1.5 million, which isn't a tremendous amount for a major motion picture, but it was the biggest budget Adrienne had ever worked with. Waitress also had some major Hollywood stars, including Kerry Russell, Nathan Fillion, Cheryl Hines, Jeremy Sisto, and Andy Griffith. Unlike the other movies Adrienne wrote and directed, she didn't have the lead role in Waitress. Instead, she has a supporting and memorable role as Dawn, one of the other waitresses at the diner. Tragically, Adrienne would never see Waitress debut to audiences. Adrienne had rented a studio apartment in Manhattan's West Village, and she used it as an office. On November 1st, 2006, her husband dropped her off at her office at around 9:30 a.m. He became concerned when he didn't hear from her throughout the day. That afternoon, he went to the building that housed her office. He asked the doorman to come with him to his wife's office. Hanging from a bedsheet that was tied to the shower curtain rod was the dead body of 40-year-old Adrienne Shelly. An autopsy was performed and she had died from strangulation. Initially, her death was ruled as suicide. Adrienne's husband, Andy Ostroy, and many of her friends and family were adamant she would not have killed herself. They said she was happy and adored her 2.5-year-old daughter. Plus, her career was at a high point and she was looking forward to the release of Waitress. So the police went back to the apartment and did some more investigating. On the lid of the toilet seat, close to where the body was hanging, they found a sneaker print made from dust. The police looked around the building and they found out that several apartments were being renovated. One of the apartments that was being renovated was directly below Adrienne's office. They discovered that the sneaker print came from the shoe of a 19-year-old construction worker named Diego Pilco. Pilco lived in the basement of the building. He was arrested and questioned. Pilco told the police he was working on the apartment below Adrienne's office. She came down and complained about the noise. Pilco said that he became annoyed and he threw a hammer at her. He missed and Adrienne stormed off. Pilco followed her and begged her not to report him. He was an undocumented immigrant from Ecuador and he didn't want any problems that might get him deported. He said that he grabbed her in the doorway of her office. He said she slapped him, so he punched her in the face. She fell to the ground and hit her head. Pilco said that he thought he had killed her. So he grabbed the bedsheet and hung her from the shower curtain rod to make it look like a suicide. He didn't know that when he hung her, he killed her. Pilco was charged with her murder, but there were many problems with his story. Mainly, Adrienne didn't have any head injuries. In February 2008, Diego Pilco pleaded guilty to first-degree manslaughter. At his hearing, he told a news story about what happened on the day Adrienne was killed. He said that he was able to sneak into Adrienne's apartment. He was trying to steal money from her purse and she caught him. He grabbed her and then strangled her to death. He then hung her to make it look like a suicide. A month after he pleaded guilty, Diego Pilco was sentenced to 25 years of prison without the chance of parole. At the time of this video, 34-year-old Diego Pilco is serving his sentence at the Coxsackie Correctional Facility in Coxsackie, New York. He's expected to be released in April 2028. He'll most likely be deported after he serves his sentence. Waitress debuted at the Sundance Film Festival in January 2008, just a few months after Adrienne's murder. The film rights were purchased by Fox Searchlight Pictures and it had a limited theatrical run. According to Box Office Mojo, it generated $22 million at the worldwide box office, making it the highest-grossing movie Adrienne had ever been involved in. Waitress was also a hit with the critics. Many critics thought that Waitress showed that Adrienne Shelly had a bright future as a writer, director, and an actor. Waitress was adapted into a stage musical and it debuted on Broadway in April 2016. It played on Broadway until 2020. A revival is planned when Broadway reopens in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic. Thank you so much for watching today's video. Please don't forget to check out the latest episode of our podcast, Into the Killing. In 1971, 5 members of the List family were murdered in cold blood. The police knew exactly who killed them, but it would still take nearly 2 decades before the case was closed. You can find Into the Killing on Amazon Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, and anywhere you listen to your favorite podcasts. Well, that's all for today. Thanks again for watching.